Engaged partisans may debate the respective symbolic roles of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, the appropriateness of commercial holiday exploitation, or the relative merits of the sentiments of tradition against the sentiments of sophistication. But it is the existing myth of Thanksgiving that continues to shape the public understanding of the holiday's meaning, history notwithstanding. Like all living myths, the Thanksgiving story is genuinely empowering for those who believe in it, and as in other matters of faith, is not amenable to arguments of reason. "'Tis the season for cultural battles. Between now and the end of December, through Thanksgiving, Advent, Hanukkah, solstice, Christmas, Kwanzaa, Chalukah, and goodness knows what else, we will be subject to fact and fiction that make the holidays delightful for some and dreadful for others. But today we will be considering why there are lies that have survived through history. In fact, history that is a lie in reference to Thanksgiving. Michael Doris writes, considering that virtually none of the standard fare surrounding Thanksgiving contains an ounce of authenticity, historical accuracy, or cross-cultural perception, why is it so apparently ingrained? Is it necessary to the American psyche to perpetually exploit and debase its victims in order to justify its history? The Oyate website includes critical evaluation of books and curricula with Indian themes, and its literary inventory lifts up writing and illustration by Native peoples from across North America. On it, Judy Dow asks, what is it about the story of the first Thanksgiving that makes it essential to be taught in virtually every grade, from preschool through high school? What is it about the story that is so seductive? Why has it become an annual elementary school tradition to hold Thanksgiving pageants with young children dressing up in paper bag costumes and feather duster headdresses and marching around the schoolyard? And why do teachers all over the country continue, for the most part unknowingly, to perpetuate this myth year after year after year? So this morning, we're going to run through the top 10 lies of history about Thanksgiving. Much of the content is taken from Deconstructing the Myths of the First Thanksgiving by Judy Dow. The format is thanks to Dave Letterman, starting with some trivial misrepresentations and ending up with those that are pretty important as to how we misunderstand or misremember Thanksgiving. After all, as author James Loewen warns, those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat the 11th grade. The story of Thanksgiving also involves some of our own UU religious history, and so it's important for us to know as much as we can know anything, because of the way that history treats Unitarian Universalism. So lie number 10, the first Thanksgiving occurred in 1621. Truth, no one knows when the first Thanksgiving occurred. People have been giving thanks for as long as people have existed. Judy Dow writes that indigenous nations all over the world have celebrations of the harvest that come from very old traditions. For Native peoples, Thanksgiving comes not once a year, but every day for all the gifts of life. And she says to refer to the harvest feast of 1621 as the first Thanksgiving disappears Indian peoples in the eyes of non-Native children. Of course, it would help if we even knew when the first Thanksgiving occurred. James Baker writes in Thanksgiving, the biography of an American holiday, that there are numerous pretenders to the title. A Thanksgiving service was held for Ponce de Leon's expedition in April of 1513 in the New Land. A Thanksgiving proclaimed in 1541 for Coronado's troops in Texas. Others in Florida, Virginia, Maine, and Newfoundland but they don't qualify because they were each an isolated instance with no connection to a future American holiday. Now, it seems that the New England Calvinist Thanksgiving is the true forerunner of our Thanksgiving. Special weekday services were held then, giving thanks for God's providence. Add in the customary English Harvest Festival and Forefathers' Day, a regional holiday in December celebrating the landing of the Pilgrims on Plymouth Rock. And it's pretty certain, according to Baker, that the holiday had a more nuanced development before American culture turned it into a glorified feast that brought Indians and Pilgrims together after a successful first harvest in 1621. In the 19th century, the modern Thanksgiving holiday started to take shape. In 1846, Sarah Josepha Hale, editor of a magazine called Godley's Ladies' Book, campaigned for an annual national Thanksgiving holiday. But it wasn't until 1863 when President Abraham Lincoln declared two national Thanksgivings, one in August to commemorate the Battle of Gettysburg, and the other in November to give thanks for general blessings. Lie number 9, the people who came across the ocean on the Mayflower were called pilgrims. Fact, the Plymouth settlers did not actually refer to themselves as pilgrims. We normally use the term pilgrim for someone who travels for religious reasons, such as Muslims who make a pilgrimage to Mecca. Judy Dow says that most of those who arrived here from England were religious dissidents who had broken away from the Church of England, and they called themselves saints. Others called them separatists. Some of the settlers were Puritans, dissidents but not separatists, who wanted to purify the church. It wasn't until around the time of the American Revolution that the name Pilgrims came to be associated with the Plymouth settlers, and the name Pilgrims became the symbol of American morality and Christian faith, fortitude, and family. We UUs have the Pilgrims as our religious forebears. Lie number 8, the colonists came seeking freedom of religion in a new land. Fact, the colonists were not just innocent refugees from religious persecution. By 1620, hundreds of native peoples had already been to England and back, most as captives, so the Plymouth colonists knew full well that the land they were settling on was already inhabited. Nevertheless, their belief system taught them that taking any land that was unimproved or wild was theirs for the taking, that the people who lived there were heathens who had no right to the land. A New Yorker Thanksgiving cartoon captures the idea of manifest destiny. It shows one pilgrim saying to another as the Mayflower puts into Plymouth Harbor, "Religious freedom is my immediate goal, but my long-range plan is to go into real estate." Both the separatists and Puritans were rigid fundamentalists who came fully intending to take the land away from its native inhabitants and establish a new nation, their holy kingdom. The Plymouth colonists were never concerned with freedom of religion for anyone but themselves. James Baker writes that the Puritans considered the doctrine of providence as the foundation of their religious view of life. Momentous events were reckoned as the revelation of God's plan for his chosen people. Lie number 7, when the Pilgrims landed, they first stepped foot on Plymouth Rock. Fact, when the colonists landed, they used a light boat to carry them from the Mayflower to the mainland. It took them to a sandy inlet, not to a rock that Judy Dow says would have smashed the boat to smithereens had they docked at a rock. Although the Plymouth settlers built their homes just up the hill from the rock, William Bradford's in Mort's Relation, a journal of the Pilgrims at Plymouth, does not even mention the rock. The actual Plymouth Rock was first referred to in a town surveying record in 1715, almost 100 years after the landing. And since then, the rock has been moved, cracked into, pasted together, carved up, chipped apart by tourists, cracked again, and now rests as a memorial to something that never happened. Dow goes on to say that it's quite possible that the myth about the pilgrims landing on a rock originated as a reference to the New Testament of the Christian Bible, in which Jesus says to Peter, "And I say unto thee, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Using scriptures to legitimize colonization and the divine destiny of the dominant religion is not unknown in Western culture. Line number 6, Squanto helped the pilgrims survive and joined them at the first Thanksgiving. Fact, an eastern Abenaki chief named Samoset was the first to contact the Plymouth colonists. He was investigating the settlement to gather information and to report to Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoag people. Samoset brought Squanto, one of the few survivors of the original Wampanoag village of Patuxet, to meet the English and keep an eye on them. Squanto had been taken captive by English captains several years earlier, and both he and Samoset spoke English. He agreed to live among the colonists and serve as a translator. But the Wampanoag oral tradition says that Massasoit ordered Squanto to be killed after he tried to stir up the English against the Wampanoag. Squanto is viewed by Wampanoag people as a traitor for his scheming against other native people for his own gain. Line number 5. The Pilgrims invited the Indians to celebrate the first Thanksgiving. Fact, according to oral accounts from the Wampanoag people, when the native people nearby first heard gunshots of hunting colonists, they thought that the colonists were preparing for war and that Massasoit needed to be informed. When Massasoit showed up with 90 men and no women or children, it can be assumed that he was being cautious. When he saw that there was a party going on, his men then went out and brought back 5 deer and lots of turkeys. In addition, both the Wampanoag and the English settlers were long familiar with harvest celebrations, and Dow says that long before the Europeans set foot on these shores, native peoples gave thanks every day for all the gifts of life and held Thanksgiving celebrations and giveaways at certain times of the year. So the coming together of two peoples to share food and company was not entirely a foreign thing for either. But the visit, that by all accounts lasted 3 days, was most likely one of a series of political meetings to discuss and secure a military alliance. Neither side totally trusted the other. The Europeans considered the Wampanoag soulless heathens and instruments of the devil, and the Wampanoag had seen the Europeans steal their seed corn and rob their graves. In any event, neither the Wampanoag nor the Europeans referred to this feast as Thanksgiving. Lie number 4, the Pilgrims provided the food for their Indian friends. Fact, Dow writes that when Massasoit showed up with 90 men and saw there was a party going on, then they went and brought back 5 deer and turkeys. Though the details of this event have become clouded in secular mythology, judging by the inability of the settlers to provide for themselves at this time, it's most likely that Massasoit and his people provided most of the food for this historic meal. Lie number 3, the Pilgrims and Indians feasted on turkey, potatoes, berries, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, and popcorn. Fact, both written and oral evidence shows that what was actually consumed at the Harvest Festival in 1621 included venison, since Massasoit and his people brought 5 deer, wild fowl, and quite possibly dried corn pounded and boiled into a thick porridge, and cooked mashed pumpkin. Dow mentions that among the other food that would have been available, fresh fruits such as plums, grapes, berries, and melons would have been out of season. It would have been too cold to dig for clams or fish for eels or small fish. There were no boats to fish for lobsters in rough water that was about 60 fathoms deep. There was not enough of the barley crop to make a batch of beer, nor was there a wheat crop. Potatoes and sweet potatoes didn't get from the south up to New England until the 18th century. nor did sweet corn. Cranberries would probably have been too tart to eat without sugar to sweeten them. They wouldn't have had pumpkin pie either. Since the corn of the time could not be successfully popped, there was no popcorn. Lie number 2, the Pilgrims and Indians became great friends. Fact, Judy Dow writes that a mere generation later, the balance of power had shifted so enormously, and the theft of land by the European settlers had become so egregious that the Wampanoag were forced into battle. In 1637, English soldiers massacred some 700 Pequot men, women, and children at Mystic Fort, burning many of them alive in their homes and shooting those who fled. The colony of Connecticut and Massachusetts Bay Colony observed a day of Thanksgiving commemorating the massacre. By 1675, there were some 50,000 colonists in the place they had named New England. That year, a son of Massasoit, Metacom, one of the first whose generosity had saved the lives of the starving settlers, led a rebellion against them. Dow says that by the end of the conflict, known as King Philip's War, most of the Indian peoples of the Northeast region had either been completely wiped out, sold into slavery, or had fled for safety into Canada. Shortly after Metacom's death, Plymouth Colony declared a day of Thanksgiving for the English victory over the Indians. So lie number 1, Thanksgiving is a happy time. Fact, for many Indian people, Dow says Thanksgiving is a time of mourning, of remembering how a gift of generosity was rewarded by theft of land and seed corn, extermination of many from disease and violence, and near total destruction of many more from forced assimilation. As currently celebrated in this country, she says, Thanksgiving is a bitter reminder of 500 years of betrayal returned for friendship. Looking at the holiday from the perspective of a Native American like Judy Dow may make us pause. We could become very confused, if not disillusioned, by the things we've been told about Thanksgiving. Thomas Bailey says that old myths never die, they just become embedded in the textbooks. James Lowen, author of Lies My Teacher Told Me, claims that American Indians have been the most lied about subset of our population. One example is the slave trade of Native Americans who wound up in the West Indies and New England. One land manager, writing in 1844 from California, said that the Indians of California make as obedient and humble slaves as the Negroes in the South. The total subservience of Native Americans is evident from the remnant of the Massachusetts tribe that buckled to the Puritans and converted to Christianity. Lowen says they did so in response to a culture that told them their religion was wrong and Christianity was right. The word in the Sioux language for white man is wasichu, which means one who has everything right. What is to be served by the lies of history? The perpetuation of privilege in our white Western culture, for one thing, which benefits from the marginalization of those with the least power. And so, as James Baldwin observed, what passes for identity in America is a series of myths about one's heroic ancestors. And conversely, those who have no place in that heroic history are dehumanized and trivialized. And this portrayal gets passed down to our children through the materials they consume in school. Education specialist Debbie Reese says that most of the commercially prepared teaching materials available present a generalized image of Native American people with little or no regard for differences that exist from tribe to tribe. And many popular children's authors unwittingly perpetuate stereotypes. Richard Scarry's books frequently contain illustrations of animals dressed in buckskin and feathers, while Mercer Mayer's alphabet book includes an alligator dressed as an Indian. As Reese observes, stereotyping is not always obvious to people surrounded by mainstream culture. It seems to me that the main thing we can take away from Thanksgiving, after we strip away the lies of history, is the real spiritual practice of gratitude. The minister of All Souls Unitarian in New York City, the Reverend Galen Gingrich, says that in the same way that Judaism is defined by obedience, Christianity by love, and Islam by submission, Unitarian Universalism should be defined by gratitude. He explains that there are two dimensions of gratitude. One has to do with a discipline of gratitude. The other has to do with an ethic of gratitude. The discipline of gratitude reminds us how utterly dependent we are on the people and world around us for everything that matters. The ethic of gratitude demands that we nurture the world that nurtures us in return. Gingrich says it's our duty to foster the kind of environment that we want to take in and therefore become. Gary Kowalski's words in our meditation this morning resonate with that idea. There is no one right way to celebrate the gifts of life, so there is no wrong way to share in love or friendship. Celebration and sharing are what we do on Thanksgiving. May each of us here this morning know the real blessings present in our lives and work toward a better, more just world. Blessed be. Amen. Our closing hymn